Welcome to Watchman Privacy. This is Gabriel Custodiate. I have no sponsors. I am independent. I am not influenced by any commercial interests. I'm not part of a company. I only shill for the truth and privacy as I see it. How many of the people you listen to can say that? That means that I need your help to support the show. Fortunately, I offer a number of ways to do so. I have courses on cybersecurity and privacy, helpful and insightful books, consulting opportunities, and of course you can leave donations, check in the show notes, or check my website, watchmanprivacy.com. Your support alone determines the future of this show. Thank you. Very pleased today to be joined by Paul Ashley from MySudo. Paul, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for inviting me to the show. I'm really pleased to be here.
Awesome. And what is your title at MySudo?
Yeah, I'm the CTO of the company, and the company's actually called Anonyome Labs. MySudo is one of our products, and I've been a CTO since we founded about 10 years ago now.
Gotcha. Yeah. So MySudo is the service, and Anonyome Labs is the company. And so let me just give people an idea. Well, actually, before we get into anything related to phone privacy, I just like to give my audience a reminder, because we like to talk about how we download GrapheneOS and suddenly we have magical phone privacy. Phone privacy involves a number of things, such as purchasing a phone with no connection to your name in cash, purchasing phone service not in your name, not bringing the phone within kilometers of your house, potentially if you're going the extreme route. And then you have operating system privacy, which is where GrapheneOS would specialize in. So there's various aspects to this. Now, MySudo is a very useful service in helping us to have additional phone numbers that are VoIP phone numbers, so that we don't have to give out our real phone number. And just looking at the app here, if you're not familiar with it, you can go into the app and it's very nicely organized. You can have up to 9 sudos, basically 9 profiles within the account. It's a paid service. And when you have your 9 accounts, you can have a phone number for each. And so you can kind of isolate various parts of your life. Maybe that's you have one for your utilities and one for whatever other aspect of your life. You have a separate phone number for your dating apps or something like this. So you can obviously see the benefit of this. Obviously, the key benefit is that you don't have to give the phone number that's attached to your SIM card, which is obviously very useful as well. This service works on phone-like devices, right? Basically, devices that have an app store. So it is not currently for your PC, though there is a way to integrate your phone using a browser extension, which we'll talk about on your computer. So that's kind of the overview of the service. And just before we start teasing people too much, Paul, what countries is the service available in? It's not available for everybody worldwide. Is that correct?
I think it's available in many countries, and depending on how you look at it. So at the moment, we only provision phone numbers in the US, Canada, and the UK, but we are doing work at the moment to extend which countries we actually provision numbers. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use the MySudo in other countries. It's just about where you can provision a phone number.
Right. And so just to be clear, let's say that you are in New Zealand and you live in New Zealand. Are you able to download MySudo and use it even if you have, let's say, an American or a UK or a Canadian number, as you say?
Yeah, sure. There's no problem with that. And a good example is me. I live in Australia, and I have US numbers, UK numbers, and Australian numbers actually, and because we've been testing Australian numbers, and so I'm actually on a trip in the US at the moment, and it is extremely useful to have these US phone numbers while I'm here.
On that topic of travel, there's a lot of international people listening, and I like to talk about traveling and internationalization. So if we're using MySudo and we have our kind of essential phone numbers on the device, very useful to just whenever you're in Wi-Fi and you have the nice VPN that's from your home country or from the US or whatever, to check your messages. What, if any, hurdles might some people encounter if they have, let's say, a foreign SIM card, or maybe they're traveling abroad? Are there any potential obstacles using the service?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there is obviously there's certain countries that we're not allowed to operate in, and we would block that. If somebody's traveling and they go to a country and the MySudo service isn't working, then that's an issue to be raised with support to find out why it's not working. What I tend to do, Gabriel, for example, on this trip, I've actually been in the US, and actually I'm actually in Berlin at the moment, I actually just get an eSIM. I've got an iPhone, I get an eSIM, and that kind of gives me the connection. And then I can use all my pseudo numbers from there. And it's really useful too, because I was actually accessing my bank in Australia, back in Australia, and one of the two-factor it asked for was, send out an SMS code to me for doing a certain operation. And because that number is my pseudo number, I could receive it, in the US or Berlin. It didn't really matter where I was, and I can get that number and use it to log in. That sort of kind of mobility is really useful. But generally, I think if someone goes to a country and it's not working, then the support team really wants to hear that.
I will say that the support for MySudo has been excellent when I have reached out to them. So if you're having trouble at all with any part of MySudo, definitely reach out to them. And so on this topic of VoIP, you just referenced the benefit of VoIP, Paul, which is that regardless what SIM card you pop in there, you have a phone number, you have phone service that is tied to the internet, and not these bizarre concoction of telecoms companies that have all these weird restrictions and all the rest. And I'm just curious, we've seen a rise in VoIP and internet-based telecoms, for lack of a better word, in recent years. Do you think that VoIP is going to be all there is in the future, or will we still have some of these old-fashioned plug in the SIM card, have a particular number attached to you, and go through the traditional means of connecting to cell towers in the old-fashioned way?
Yeah, I think we're kind of in sort of a phase where it is changing. If I think about 20 years ago, we all had home phone numbers, and we all had, those PSTN lines, and people would call our home phone numbers. Now, I probably haven't had a home phone number for 10 years because, I changed over to mobile. And then the first phase of that is, you've got a SIM number, and that becomes your kind of personal number, and people call you on that. I think this is the next phase, which is get multiple VoIP numbers and then be able to use those. And the whole idea, and I can give you a bit of the history of MySudo, the way we came at MySudo is we actually were thinking about, sort of what you have in enterprises, proxies, like web proxies. And the idea with MySudo is to kind of have those proxies, but your pseudos are your proxies. And the idea is you don't give out your SIM number ever, maybe to your family, maybe to some close friends, and that's all you give it out to. The rest of the time, you're using VoIP numbers, and the advantage of that is that they're disposable. So I'll give you an example. You want to go and buy a car, and you know what happens. You go to a bunch of dealers and you give them the phone number and that, and they want to call you and all that. But the big problem is you leave this big data trail, right? All of those dealerships you've talked to now put you on the I'm going to call him forever list. And not only that, but they sell your number to other people. So the big advantage of the VoIP numbers too is that the ability to create one for a certain situation and then get rid of it at the end of that. Or you can have them for a long time and they can become like your personal number or your work number. I have about 8 pseudos, or maybe 9 now actually. And I have, a number for work, and I have a number that I actually use with my friends. And I have another number that I use with charities that I, give money to. Kind of et cetera, et cetera. And I have one, because I'm traveling at the moment, I also have one for traveling. And those ones for like donations and travel are kind of semi-permanent. I use them for a long time. Whereas there are other situations where I might just create one, use it for scenario, and then drop it. So I do think, Gabriel, that you're right, that we're in that phase of really that what your phone needs to have is like with my eSIM. So the eSIM I've got at the moment, it doesn't give me a phone number. It's just a way of getting an internet connection from the phone, and being able to have a bunch of VoIP numbers behind that, I think is really useful. And I think that's where we're going.
Yeah, it seems pretty clear that that is the direction things are headed. Now, on that topic, a lot of privacy advocates have joined the VoIP arms race, as it were, not just to have additional phone numbers, but also because it is, in many cases, a lot easier to get a VoIP number without giving a lot of information to sign up. And that's certainly possible with MySudo. And I am just curious, do you think that as we see a lot of demand for KYC for every service and protecting against the quote unquote bad guys, this endless quest for taking down the bad guys who use privacy services, Do you think that there will eventually be more of a demand in, let's say, the West for KYC just to be able to use a VoIP service?
It's kind of interesting that you say that, Gabriel, because we've actually been in that situation for the last 3 months with MySudo development. So the UK, up to I think it's the start of June, it's been like the US numbers where you, without doing any sort of identity verification, you could get a UK number and use that UK number. Now that law changed in the UK, so we're about to release a new version of MySudo, both for iOS and Android. And the difference with that version is it actually does identity verification if you want a UK number, and that's just because of UK law. So it's actually become now more common. I've seen it over the last 10 years where more and more countries have forced KYC or identity verification of the person to get a number. So yeah, unfortunately, we've seen more and more of that. At the moment, what we do is we obey the law. So in the UK, we've had to change the software for MySudo. So once this next version comes out, when you request a UK number, you will have to go through that identity verification. We just don't have much choice.
That's good to know. At any rate, for people who are looking for British phone numbers, and I suspect that these sorts of things will be coming for the other countries as well. Though, random question here. Let's say that people have a phone number, an old phone number. They're trying to kind of restart things, start their private life. Can they port their phone number that they don't want to lose, understandably, into MySudo as one of their, let's say, 9 sudos?
Yeah, they certainly can. And there's a process. The way you do that is go through support, and support allows you to move your SIM number into a MySudo number. So it becomes a number of one of your sudos. So that is certainly possible.
Yeah, and I definitely recommend that. I'll echo. Big fan of Michael Bazzell. Obviously, I think it was through him that I originally heard of MySudo. He's a big proponent of never getting rid of a number that has once been attached to you, and I think that's good advice. Now, when we use MySudo, Paul, you just mentioned things that will be coming to UK phone numbers. But in general, right now, what is required to sign up for the service? What do we have to give up to use the service?
So if let's say you're in the US and you want to sign up, and it's true around the world. When you sign up for MySudo, you don't have to give us any personal information. In fact, we really don't want personal information. And so when you sign up, you don't need to. As I said, that's changed now. If you request a UK number, you have to go through identity verification. And so we've had to do that. We also have to do that for virtual cards as well. So if you want to use our virtual cards service, which is about, instead of using your plastic credit card on a website, you generate a MySudo virtual card and you use that to spend, and that obviously keeps that plastic card safe. So there are 2 instances where we have to do identity verification, but if you're not getting a UK number and not using virtual cards, then we don't do any collection of any personal data whatsoever. We don't create an account. The way MySudo works is everything's done through cryptography. So your MySudo app has a bunch of private keys that allow you to access services on the back end as you, and we don't have any access to those private keys. So we can't impersonate you, and we certainly don't know who you are.
I know that Michael Bazzell is extreme, and we love that. And one thing that he points out is that MySudo is a paid service, so we do have to pay to get his full functionality and to get our additional phone numbers. And the way we would do that is either through the Google Play Store or through the Apple Store. And both Apple and Google have their own process. You have to give them some information and obviously a payment method. Now you can use gift cards and things of this sort. This is what Michael Bazzell recommends. Definitely recommend people go to Intel Techniques and check out his book on phones. He mentions MySudo and the process, the somewhat elaborate process he goes into to get MySudo with very much no attachment to his name. I'm just curious if you're familiar with that, Paul.
Yeah, he does have a strategy around that, and it's pretty elaborate. So he'll go and pay cash to get a phone. You'll then go and get a SIM card, actually, with and try to get an anonymous SIM card, and he goes through this process. And then when he wants to get a MySudo subscription, you're quite right, for either the App Store or the Play Store. He then uses gift cards for that. And I've done all that myself as well to try it, and it does work. But, Michael is more on the extreme side. So he is very, very protective of both himself and his clients. And so he does have a whole process that he takes them through so that they can get a phone, get MySudo, and they can start interacting again without having to fear that someone can track them.
Also, a lot of people who listen to the show are using GrapheneOS. GrapheneOS doesn't natively have the ability to have payments to the Google Play Store within it. So if somebody were using MySudo on GrapheneOS, am I right, Paul, in saying that you would have to have an account with a legitimate either Google account on a regular Android phone or a legitimate Apple phone? You'd have to pay through that service, and then you could sync that account to your GrapheneOS device.
Yeah, that's quite correct. And I'll talk about, there might be some changes coming around this area, but you're quite correct. The way you'd have to do it is at least get a MySudo account on an Android device or an iOS device with the Play Store or the App Store. And then, with MySudo, you can kind of put it across multiple devices. So what you do is you do kind of use that QR code transfer that onto a GrapheneOS phone, and you can use that on there. The reason I say this may change is one of the things we're doing at the moment is looking at our own payment system outside of the App Store and the Play Store. And we're doing that because we're actually releasing another product called Reclaim, and that's sort of a web style product. And we said, well, we need our own payment systems for that. And so there is one of the things we're considering next is saying, well, once we've got that payment system in place for the Reclaim product, then we could look at how we might be able to use that with MySudo as well. So things might change in this area.
And before I get into some of the kind of nosy privacy questions, as is the tradition of these kind of shows, I just want to say that I would encourage pretty much everyone to be using MySudo if you're interested in privacy. So blanket recommendation for everybody to give it a go. It will certainly be a good part of your privacy arsenal. So that's my glowing recommendation of the service. And then maybe on to the most nosy question that I can ask, which is that if MySudo got a court order to know everything about a particular user, what would MySudo be able to give?
It's actually a very good question, Gabriel, and we do get them from time to time. We don't get a lot, but we certainly do get orders to provide information. Now, when that happens, usually what we do is we respond to them and we give what we can, which in most cases virtually nothing, because we're not keeping any, we don't keep any long-term data around IP connections or anything about you. I mean, as I said, you can get a MySudo, you can be using it, and have never given us any personal information. So mostly when we respond to those, we could just say we don't have information about that user that you're requesting. And the way that usually works is they'll request it through this phone number, and they'll say, look, we want every information on the user that had this phone number. And normally we'll say to them, we'll reply and say, we just don't have any information on this user.
Let's say that I'm using MySudo and I am both texting and calling John Doe. We text and we call over the course of many months, many years. I can see in my app a list of our conversation. Where is that data being stored?
That data is stored on your phone, and it's protected, right? It's protected, so we can't get access to that information. Obviously, in real time when it's happening, we know we know the number that it's connected to, but in the back end, we're not keeping a long-term, list of, your call records. Like you can go into MySudo and you can see, this, I had a call in, I made a call out, you can see all of that, but we don't keep that in the back end. That's all stored on the phone.
MySudo, if you're calling somebody else using MySudo, then there's some encryption involved there. But if you're just using it to call people without MySudo, then that person, their phone number, their telecoms company would have their own vulnerabilities, their own potential records of that conversation.
Yeah, correct. So let's explain that in some detail. So there's two different situations. If, say, you and I, Gabriel, both have MySudo, if I called your number, my pseudo number, or the handle, because you can create a handle for a pseudo, then that calling, whether it's a voice call or a video call, is end-to-end encrypted. So you and I, it's end-to-end encrypted. Anyone tries to intercept that, and they can't get that. And the same as if I send you a message. So I can send you a message from my sudo to your sudo, and that's end-to-end encrypted. So voice, video, and messaging, we've both got MySudo, is end-to-end encrypted. When you're going from MySudo outside, so you're calling a phone number or you're sending what's really an SMS to an external number, then both of those communications are in the clear. So someone, for example, at the telco could be recording your voice, or they could record the SMSs, etc. And there's nothing that we can do about that, other than the fact that it comes from a phone number that's it's a MySudo number, and it's not your home, or your personal SIM card number. So people need to be aware of that. If both ends have got MySudo, it's end-to-end encrypted, no one can get anywhere near it. If you're calling outside of MySudo, as you said, it becomes sort of a PSTN call and an SMS, which are both in the clear, because that's just how the network works.
Right. But presumably that would be going through the person you're calling. That would be going through their telecom provider, or
That's correct. Yeah, it would, because it starts as a VoIP number, it goes out onto the PSTN number network, and then maybe it's an AT&T number at the other end, and goes that call gets routed to AT&T so that the other person can pick up that call and answer it and talk on that. And same with when you're sending a text message, it's an SMS, and again it goes out to the PSTN network and then out to that phone.
Right. And of course, you, the listener, know that you should be using things like Signal and all the rest any chance you get. And of course, we have all these conversations and calls to public companies that we need to actually use a real, legitimate phone number for. And that's where MySudo definitely kicks in. And as Paul said, if you know somebody else using MySudo, then you're getting the end-to-end encrypted protection.
That's correct. Yeah, and even the fact that you're calling out, and it's still giving you a layer of protection. So let's say you've created a sudo for home projects, so plumber, electrician, carpenter, whatever you need at home. You can still give them a MySudo phone number to interact with, and you're not giving out a personal SIM type number or your home phone number or something like that. So there's still a level of protection there. It's just that it's not an end-to-end encrypted link, because that's just not how the voice calling and the SMS system works.
As I mentioned in my introduction, this is a service for devices that have an app store. Have there been any considerations of having MySudo as a desktop program?
Yeah, in fact, we're building that at the moment. So one thing that we released, I'm trying to think now, within the last 6 months, is the browser extension. And we released the browser extension just so that you could access your sudo information when you're, say, on your desktop and you're accessing a website. So, we have an extension for Chrome and Safari and Firefox and Edge, I think. And so the idea there is, from that extension, and you pair that extension to your MySudo app, and it provides to that extension all your MySudo details, so phone number, email address, if you've got any virtual credit cards, anything like that is available in the extension. And the idea is that it becomes really easy then to form fill your sudo details into a form. So that's the browser extension story. So we're still working on that. So we're going to be releasing new versions of the browser extension this year that, for example, integrates password management. So you can go and create a new account, use your sudo details, and even create a password for that account for that sudo. So there's a lot happening in the browser extension space. But there's also, the other thing that we've been building is a desktop application for Mac and Windows, which will allow you to access your MySudo capabilities. And we're starting with email, we'll go to messaging, and then eventually voice calling from a desktop application. And that's mainly through demand. People are saying, look, I love it when I'm out and about using MySudo, but if I'm sitting at home and I'm doing on my computer, I want to be able to answer my messages, my MySudo messages. I want to be able to do a call. I want to be able to answer my emails while I'm sitting at the desktop.
Right. Or as Michael Bazell has sometimes said, you don't want to have the phone anywhere but in a Faraday bag when it's on your property. So if you have the computer version, obviously this is not built yet, but The idea is that we have our computer. It doesn't have all the chips and all this other GPS stuff that traditional phones have. So that's good. And so we make the connection to the from the phone, presumably, which has the main account, to the desktop application, and then we don't have to worry. We don't have to touch the phone.
So it's so correct. So in the browser extension, it's kind of a pairing method. So what pairing means is I'm providing some of the cryptographic keys that are on the device that MySudo uses out to that browser extension. In the same way, the desktop application will need access to some keys so that it can, act as that pseudo in communication. So that'll come out, when we release the desktop application. Over time, you'll see the first version will come out with email, and the second version will come out with messaging, and then the next version will come out with voice calling. And it's just providing those capabilities. And as you said, you don't need access to your phone while you're doing any of that.
Theoretically, Paul, if a KYC mandate were to go into effect, that would presumably affect the people who have already had aged pseudo accounts. Would that make sense to you? Obviously, I doubt they would be exempt.
No, I believe they would be exempt. What I think would happen, and the reason I'm giving you this answer is this is the UK process. So what happens with the change in the UK? As I said, we're releasing the new version of MySudo. It's probably this week actually. That'll have this UK support for identity verification. It's only for new numbers that are provisioned. So the idea is from this date going forward, if you provision a UK number, then you have to go through identity verification at least once for your pseudos to be able to get UK numbers. That doesn't mean that you have to go back to the previous ones that you've got. So even in the UK case, you're not going to go into identity verification with the numbers that you've already got. It's only once you provision a new number.
I wonder if you'd agree with this statement that having a MySudo number reduces your threat to being SIM swapped.
Oh, 100%. 100%. Yeah, it's much, much safer. We've never had an instance of a MySudo number being SIM swapped. Never had that. I think it's much, much safer. I generally don't like SMS as a second factor. That's assuming what you're talking about there is SMS as a second factor. I much prefer to use other methods, like one-time password type methods. But there are certain examples, and as I said, the example I gave, one of the banks in Australia that I use uses SMS for a second factor when you want to do certain operations. It is much safer to use my pseudo number for that than it is to use a SIM card for that.
So as you were mentioning, everything that we do on the app on our original device is only accessible to us. I guess that would be zero knowledge encryption. Now, the problem I guess people might think is, well, what happens if I lose my phone or I get a new phone or something like this? What does that process involve?
Oh, okay. So it's a really good process. It's a really good question because what happens is when you install MySudo and register and all that, it's, as I said, it starts to create these cryptographic keys, and depending on what services you're using within the app, it creates more and more cryptographic keys, and it's using public key cryptography, so it's creating private keys, and the idea of a private key, it just stays on your device. The public key you can make public, and I'll give you an example of that. So when you're doing, as I said, end-to-end encrypted voice calling between two MySudo devices, you will have created a key pair, and let's say you're talking to me, I'll have created a key pair. We'll swap public keys and we'll be able to do end-to-end encryption. And there's virtually no way for anyone to get to that. Like, we don't have access to the private keys. So certainly MySudo, can't get access to it, and really no one else can. But that's a really good security solution. But the risk for a user is I drop the phone in the toilet, the phone's gone, I lose all my cryptographic keys, I can't use MySudo. So then you've got to look at how you can back it up. The way I personally do it, so as I said, I've got an iPhone, I've got a Mac, I just periodically, maybe once a month, back it up to the Mac. And you can do that, that's no problem. The other way to do it is you can, for example, create another device, and you can do that, transfer of the MySudo account to the other device. You can do that as well. And if you have a look in MySudo, it has this option of, kind of doing a backup, and it allows you to do a backup and store that. So there's different techniques for doing it, but it's something you need to do because if if, for example, you've got your MySudo on one phone and you've never used one of the multiple backup mechanisms, then you're in trouble if you lose that phone, because you're just not going to be able to recover your MySudo account, because the private keys on there that are active are only on your phone.
Absolutely. So anytime you're using a privacy service, you need to, right from the start, have a backup plan and stick to it. That's definitely a big part of this. So let's say in that scenario, Paul, that somebody only has it on one device, the device breaks, it's gone. Is that account just gone into the ether?
Yes, I think the answer to that is yes, because we won't have access to those private cryptographic keys. What you would have to do is go through support, and you'd have to go through and create a whole new account, which it's not great, especially like if you've given, as you said, you had the example where you've given your number out to different services. And so it would be pretty, kind of annoying to go through and, you can create a new MySudo account, sure, on a phone, and create new sudos and get phone numbers and everything, but you're going to have to then go back to all those services and swap out those numbers.
Yeah, that would be really painful. As I said that out loud, I thought, like, you know what, time to get a second and a third backup.
So what I do, for example, I do multiple things. So I have an iOS phone and I have an Android phone, and I've transferred my iOS account across over to the Android phone. So I've got an immediate backup. And as I said, and then I want to be extra safe, so I'll back it up to my Mac as well, the phone up to my Mac. So I probably take 2 or 3 different methods to make sure I'm safe with MySudo, because, I use MySudo for everything. I'm on traveling at the moment. I use my travel sudo, all the hotels, the airlines, Uber, all of those things are using those sudo, both email address and phone number. So for me, to lose my sudo account would be devastating, because I probably have somewhere between 100 and 200 different accounts that are using sudo details, because I've been using it for a while. Like, after a while, it just becomes kind of natural that you never go and use personal information anymore. Anytime I need to create a new account, I'm always using a sudo. So I use the sudo email address, I use the sudo phone number. If I need to buy something, and then I can get a virtual card for that. So I just find that over time, your behaviour changes, and you never go back to using personal information anymore. But it also means that I'm pretty tied into MySudo, and so that's why I think I take multiple backup strategies to make sure I could never lose that account.
I've talked to a few people. A lot of people like MySudo. Occasionally, people will mention things like SMS that they were expecting didn't come in, or having a little bit of trouble using a particular sudo, or it's not quite 100%, let's say, of your traditional phone. Little things crop up. Obviously, get in touch with the great customer service. Is there anything going on, though, for people to just get some context about why that might be happening, and maybe what they can do so it doesn't happen more frequently? I know, for example, a lot of these people have never used MySudo outside of a VPN.
Yeah, I think one of so why does it happen occasionally? Well, what I find, and I'm the same, so I use MySudo VPN. So we have a VPN as well called MySudo VPN, which you can install on your phone, and that's what I do. And I try to use my VPN everywhere. Where I find I might have some trouble with MySudo is when the network's not great. So like, as I'm sitting in a hotel at the moment, the Wi-Fi here is a bit weak. And then I've also noticed that the VPN, the strength of the communication through the VPN. So I'm sitting in Germany at the moment, so I'm going through the Frankfurt egress point. I'm finding that's not as good as when I'm in the US or in Australia. So I think one of the problems is this is an IP-based app, and you're trying to do voice calls over IP and stuff. And so, different to the PSTN, which is kind of pretty consistent all the way through, when you're using an IP-based app, so you're doing your calling and your SMSing, etc., over IP, you're at the mercy of the IP network to some extent. And if the network's great, you don't see any problems. But when it's a little bit weaker, I've noticed that calling can be a bit harder. You may even lose the odd message, and it's more a case of you're on a poor network.
And one thing I've done, if let's say I hit the call dial button and it doesn't dial, sometimes I'll switch to a different VPN or a different server, and sometimes that will solve it.
Yeah, and I think that's because of the IP network. I find, when I'm in the US or in Australia, I generally find that the the networks are pretty good and I don't have as many problems. But I've noticed here in Europe, for example, where I am in Berlin, connecting through Frankfurt, which is the egress point, I've noticed the network's a bit weaker, the hotel's a bit weaker. And so I expect I'd have a few more issues here than what I have when the network's pretty consistent.
So in the past, this was worse, but recently it seems I have not encountered any problems recently. But sometimes there will be services that can detect that this is not a quote unquote real phone number, and they will not let you use it. Recently, for example, though this has changed, Apple Podcasts and YouTube would say, yeah, this is not a, I forget the language. This is not a real phone number, basically, so we're not going to let you use it. Now, that's been cleared up the last time I checked, but just curious what was going on there, if you're aware of any other services and yeah, what's going on there?
Yeah, so it is. You do find that. I probably think we're over 95% of different, and what you're talking about there is using it to sign up. And you might using it for two-factor or something like that. I think we're probably, if I was to go across 100 services, we probably work for 95, and maybe there's 5 that we don't work for. And what they're doing, those services, they're particularly looking for VoIP numbers. And if they can work out that it's a VoIP number, they will block it. Now, it is the exception rather than the norm. Like, be honest, I think the problem's actually a lot less than it was, say, 5 years ago. I think the problem was worse. Now I find I can just use the pseudo emails and the pseudo phone numbers just about everywhere. But you will occasionally get that happen where they'll say, this is not a real number and we won't let you use it. Sometimes you can just try a different pseudo number, get a new pseudo number or something and try that. But it's probably just a few exceptions where they will purposely look for a VoIP number and then say, look, you're not allowed to use that for this service. That does happen.
And do you think the trend is towards more acceptance of VoIP? As we said, this is a growing service.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. I would think, MySudo is about 5 years old, and I think it's much better now than it was 5 years ago. I think there's more and more acceptance of VoIP numbers, and so maybe in a few years there'll be virtually 100% acceptance of VoIP numbers.
Let's say somebody's getting in touch with customer service based on an error they had. What exposure is there for the extreme privacy folks out there? What exposure is there when we connect to customer service? What are they able to see about us or our account?
So what will happen usually is you'll go through the app and create an email to support, and it will create a bit of a profile of you. And I can't remember offhand exactly what the data is, but there'll be a bit of profile about your account, etc., so that they can help diagnose the problem. So by connecting with support, you're not giving any of your personal information, but you're certainly giving a little bit of MySudo information to them so that they can, for example, to see if there's a problem with your account. They don't know that it's you, Gabriel, but they know that MySudo app is connected to that account, and so they can go and see if there's any known problems there or anything. So there is a little bit of MySudo app information that's given to support when you make a support request, and that's just to help with the support process. But again, it doesn't give any information about yourself as the person, because we're not interested in that. We're just interested in how do we fix the problem you've got.
Right, and they don't see messages or...
No, we can't see any of that. So because everything lands on your phone, once it's on your phone, we just can't, we can't get to it. So, and we don't keep, for example, we don't keep SMSs in the back end. We don't keep messages, in the back end, like SMS messages or even end-to-end encrypted messages. None of that stuff gets kept in the back end. The only thing we keep in the back end is email. But again, it's encrypted. So what happens when an email comes in, we encrypt it with your public key and it gets stored in the back end. So the only person that can decrypt it is you, because you've got the private key. So all the email that's sitting there, we can't access.
Is there any truth to this statement that using MySudo reduces robocalls?
Does it? And the answer is yes, because the services that we use do try to reduce robocalls. That's part of the service, to reduce robocalls. So I'd say the answer in general is yes. It doesn't mean that you don't get any, but there's certainly... You would get less robocalls on a pseudo number than you're going to get on your SIM number. I'll put it that way.
Moving on to just a couple other features. We've been talking about the phone numbers, but each pseudo has a email as well, something at sudomail.com. What do the privacy enthusiasts need to know about the emailing service baked into the app?
It's a pretty traditional email service. So, and I'll give you an example. So, as I said, I've got a travel pseudo, and not only do I give my travel pseudo's phone number to, hotels, Uber, airlines, anything I'm doing with travel, but I also give them my pseudo travel email address. And what that means is that, they can send you emails. So, for example, I'll get an email to say, your flight's tomorrow, go and check in. And so it's just a pretty normal email service. Probably the difference is, though, as I said, when the email arrives, we immediately encrypt it with your public key, where you've got a private key on your phone, and so it's stored on the back end with encrypted, so no one can look at it, including us. Only you can retrieve it and then decrypt it with your private key. But it's a pretty traditional email service. At the moment, you get one email address per pseudo. And so each of my pseudos has an email address, and I use it actively. Now, just like the phone numbers, there's occasionally a service that won't accept the sudomail domain name. So we have one domain name, and the reason we've done that is so that we get more and more traffic on that domain name, so less and less blockage by services. So just like the VoIP numbers, though, occasionally you'll try to use it. I'm trying to think, I tried to use it on a service recently. I think it was Discord. I was actually trying to use a sudomail.com email address for one of my pseudos, because I have a software pseudo for any time I'm using software. And I think I tried to use my software pseudo, email address on Discord, and I think it wouldn't allow that. So that's very similar to the VoIP situation, where it's probably 95% where it'll accept the sudomail, and then occasionally you'll find one that doesn't.
Right, and Discord's they're really strict. I seem to recall they wouldn't even allow Proton Mail.
I think that's true. So they're more on the extreme end, and that's sort of like, I would say, I've got probably somewhere between 100 and 200 accounts, attached to pseudos, and it's probably in the single digit percents where I find a problem. It's not very often. It's rare enough that when it happened for, say, Discord, I'm surprised. I'm really surprised, because the 20 accounts I've created before that have all used pseudo email addresses, no problem. But again, sometimes you will find that the service will go, that's not a, but they don't use it's not a real email address, because obviously it is, but I think they call it a disposable email address. So it's occasionally, I think that's what Discord uses, something like language like that. You'll find that it's more on the rare side.
And obviously, I would commend the listener to, if you're interested in email privacy and how it's impossible in the way that you think, revisit my discussion with Skiff and Andrew Milich. Skiff is no longer in business, but he talks a lot about email privacy. And obviously, MySudo is not going to see your messages, but if you're messaging somebody and they're using Gmail, then Gmail is going to get a copy of that conversation. So still very convenient to have a email address with each of your pseudos. Not something I've used a lot, but definitely something I'll be looking into. Now, the final feature of the app, Paul, is the virtual digital credit cards. People who use privacy.com will be familiar with the concept. Now, these are not free. You pay 2.99% plus 31 cents. And you do at this point have to give your real information. This is probably very normal, standard KYC process. For people who maybe they're interested, they're going to pay the approximately 3%, and they're willing to give their real information because they understand how this works. Are they, though, now connecting their name and KYC information to the other aspects of this app, such as their phone numbers, messages, etc.?
So it's a good question. So let me talk first a little bit about virtual cards and what the purpose of it is. So the idea is in your wallet you might have 2 or 3 credit cards, and if you go and use them on a website, I want to go and buy a part for my bike, you've got the risk of that credit card information being stolen or misused by an employee or whatever. And, you get that situation where, someone goes and spends on your credit card until they spend all the money on it, then they throw it away, and then you're left trying to clean up the mess with the bank and getting a new credit card and all that. So that's the purpose of it. At the moment, when you get a virtual card, we call it a virtual card or virtual credit card, it's attached to a funding source. And the funding source in MySudo is a credit card, and that's why we have that fee that you talked about. It's like 2.9% plus 30 cents or whatever it is, right? That's why we have that fee, because the current funding source is a credit card. One of the things that we're adding at the moment, we've been working on for quite a while, is to add ACH, which is access of a bank account as the funding source for a virtual card. Then the cost will go down quite considerably, because it doesn't. The problem with credit cards is they have every time you buy something with your credit card, there is this quite large fee on it, which the merchant has to pay. And so in this case, once we get ACH, that cost will come down. So one of the things we're doing is ACH. The other thing is we're adding virtual cards into Android. So MySudo Android doesn't have the virtual card support, and we're adding that at the moment as well. So hopefully both of those things will come out quite soon. We'll have virtual cards on Android, and we'll have the ACH support, which will improve it. So that's kind of a bit of the background, just for your listeners, at why we did virtual cards. And it's really to say, and the question really comes, are you giving information away to MySudo? And the answer is we do have to go through identity verification. So what happens there is we'll take you through an identity verification process. And it usually it could be one phase where it's like, give us some information. We can check that. Okay, that's valid information. You've been identity verified. And then we just go and store some stuff away, encrypted away, and kind of don't look at it again. Then if that sort of simple information doesn't work, then you can go to a more complex identity verification. Like, let's say there's something wrong with the data, then it might ask you for a document check or something like that. The question I think you asked is, do we then tie that KYC information or that identity verification information to the rest of your MySudo? And the answer is not really. And I'll tell you why, is because we go through that identity verification, and then all we have to do is just package some information up and store it in the back end, just because of regulation, and we never go back to it again. So in our minds, you're still kind of unknown to us, even though we've taken you through identity verification. We don't sort of attach to your MySudo account, this is Gabriel and whatever else we've learned. That's stored away in kind of an encrypted in the back end and just put in there for regulatory purposes. But essentially, like, if somebody was to go to our back end and look up the account, they'd still see no personal information attached to that account.
And so you have the information of presumably the card number and therefore the identity attached to it, but there's nothing that they could get from that information that would tie it to, let's say, a phone number. Or obviously, if you gave away your phone number in that transaction, that could potentially be a smoking gun. But otherwise, you would be able to give the KYC information that you've stored on your end, as you have to, and the card details, but there would not be any connection to the messages, the other elements of the Sudo account.
Yeah, so the answer is they wouldn't be able to get to any of your message or anything. As I said before, all of that stuff's on your phone and protected. If the court order came in and said this virtual card was used, then we would probably have to, and I'd have to go back to our risk and compliance team to just double check this, but I think we would have to give that KYC information out. And the reason is that's the purpose of it having to go through identity verification and the storage is when it's a financial transaction, and even in the US, the government is more sensitive about that. And so if they were to say, with this credit card, we need to find out who the individual is, I'm pretty sure that we would have to pass that information on. Now, I don't think we've ever had that request, to be honest, but if we did, then I think we would have to, because that's the point of doing it, is that because it's anytime there's financial transactions involved, the government wants the ability to be able to tie that back to a real individual.
Paul, just wondered if there's anything I didn't mention that we should touch on, especially for people really into privacy, any aspects, any topics that I didn't bring up that would be of interest to them.
Related to that, we've talked quite a bit, haven't we? We've talked about the phone numbers, we've talked about email addresses, talked about virtual credit cards. There's also the built-in browser on the devices as well. And the reason we have that is so that as if you want to, for example, do some health research or something, then you bring up just say you've got a pseudo related to health research. You open up that browser, and it is a completely isolated browser from any other pseudo, and isolated from your phone Safari type apps. So it's another layer of protection where we're trying to say, let's keep that isolated. And then if you go and have a look at the settings in those browsers, you can put things like keep no history and do all those things. So it's aimed to give you another level of protection. So rather than just say you're on an iPhone, and rather than you open up Safari and browse, what I always do is I always go into MySudo and open up the browser there, because I know when I'm using Safari that I don't know what they're doing with any data. Whereas I know when you're using the MySudo browser that we're certainly not collecting any data about you. So that's probably another layer of protection. When you're using, any browser that comes with the phone, then you don't really know what sort of information they're keeping track and kind of sending back to home base.
Okay, and so you are part of Anodyne Labs, which presumably has, well, you mentioned the VPN, but has things beyond MySudo. Feel free to share what other things that Anodyne Labs is working on or already has, and whatever you feel like sharing about what we can expect in the future.
Yeah, so it's actually pronounced Anonyome Labs. It's a hard thing to say because it actually stands for Anonymous Me. It came from Anonymous Me. So we wanted to just a bit of history there. So when we first created the company Anonyme, we wanted to create a real privacy company. So we came up with this term Anonyme Me. Anonymous Me, and became Anonyme. And then where did pseudos come from? Well, it came from the word pseudonym. Right, so it's like creating pseudonyms for yourself.
Gotcha.
And that's the history of that. There is actually a new product that we're releasing very soon. I suspect in the next couple of weeks, and it's called Reclaim. And what that's for is to help you sort of clean up your footprint. And what that means is, the reason it's called Reclaim is reclaim those accounts that you've got out there. So what it does is you point in this first version, let's say you've got a Gmail account, you point it at the Gmail account, it'll go through and access your Gmail account, you give it access to it, and it goes through and looks at and it really only has to look at like the kind of the subject and the domain of the sending of the email. And then we can tell you, here's 30 accounts that you've got that you're receiving email on, and what do you want to do with them? And there's a few choices that you can make, right, to clean it up. One is you can say, I want to unsubscribe from that account. The second is like, I want to keep that account, but I want to swap it over with my pseudo details. And that's certainly what I've done. So I virtually don't have any accounts out there that don't have my pseudo details. And then the last one is it will give you instruction about how to actually do that, delete my account, which is kind of the strongest thing you can do, which is tell a service that you want to tell them to delete all the information about you. So the reason it's called Reclaim is we've got lots and lots of kind of digital trails out there where over time we've created accounts. A bunch of them aren't really needed anymore. And so it's about cleaning those up so you've got a smaller footprint on the internet. And also, if you want to keep the account, then why don't you swap it over with a MySudo email address, MySudo phone number, etc. So that is a new product that's coming out. And so those are what we call our three consumer apps, which is MySudo VPN, and then Reclaim.
Roger that. So this has been Paul Ashley of Anonyme Labs, which makes MySudo. MySudo is one of the three that I use, and I would encourage all of you to look into it. Obviously, we know we need to support these privacy companies, and if you are extreme about your privacy, definitely go to inteltechniques.com, read Michael Bazzel's book on phone privacy to see how to acquire the service with the most extreme means possible. I have a chapter in my privacy guide on phone privacy as well to kind of be realistic about things. But otherwise, I encourage everybody to consider adding MySudo to their arsenal. I will have links to all the Anonyme Lab stuff in the description. And Paul, any final thoughts?
No, just thank you for having me on, Gabriel. It's been great talking about this. But I think the way people should look at MySudo is that it is a little bit of a journey, and the way you should start is get MySudo, create one or two sudos, and start using that. And then over time, you sort of start to work out your profile of interactions, and you say, well, I'll create a third one and a fourth one, and then as I said, I've got 9 sudos now, and that's just about as you compartmentalize your life better and better. As I said, you start to work out where all your habits are. And, I have to have a sports sudo because of my kids play sport. And so I use those details when I'm interacting with coaches and other people, other parents and stuff. So I think people should just consider a journey. If they're new to MySudo, start with one or two sudos, learn how to use it, and then build up over time until you get literally, if you get to a situation where I am, where all of my accounts are now attached to MySudo and using it I use it multiple times every single day. And I feel like I do have that layer of protection.